Let me go. Awesome. Thank you, Raphael. I'm going to find, I think, the link I wanted to use to start with and share my screen. Yeah, so I'll just start with an image, as we'll start with a little talking, and then I'll start sharing code. So is everyone looking at a website right now with sort of like an image that's a visualization of an HTML document, and can they see me highlighting text and stuff?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you, folks. Yeah, so real quick, and my apologies too for like a weird, if there's like a weird camera angle for me, just don't read too much into it. Yeah, so before I kind of dive into this, does anyone want to just take a crack and give me like a short, if one can't even do a short description of what the document object model is?
Isn't it just like a object visualization of a web page? So that way you can call on things that.
Yeah, that's like 50%. Zach, I think that was you, Zach. I was let me because I can't always see everyone in the Zoom chat when someone talks. Thank you. Yeah, it like, and I would just drop the word visualization. We've all seen Python classes, right? And so, you know, if you can kind of imagine, you've got an HTML page, but you want to be able to write code that changes your HTML page and can do things like handle user input. You could almost imagine having like a giant DOM class, and DOM stands for document object model. And it's like, we need to like take the same way that the Python interpreter or virtual machine or the JavaScript engine, virtual machine or compiler, or that a compiler for a language like Java or C takes the code, the source code that we write, interprets it, and then does stuff within the machine. Our browser does the same thing. Like the document that they're talking about is an HTML document, you know, to scroll up to here and to show this example with like, and I'll share this link later. I think this is a great site. Like this is a document and it's got a particular format, and that format, as we're learning, is HTML. And like Jacob, you had a great question about the HTML format with classes and stuff. And the reason it's like this is because this way we can give our document structure. And we can see that structure here. And here's like one visualization of it, right, with nesting. And this also forms a tree. Like an HTML document is actually a tree. And here's like sort of the tree diagram of an HTML document. This is, you know, the parent, and then each child, each element inside one element is a child. And to pop over to my Visual Studio Code. So like right here, this is the parent of my tree. This is the first child. Inside that child is another child. So we're kind of going 1, 2, 3 nodes down. And then here's the second node again from the parent. And we can kind of see that represented here, but with more stuff. And the reason that we care about this is because we need to give our document to the browser in a structured way so that it can understand it and transform it into something that it puts in memory, like an object, like an instance of an object. And it does that, you know, when my browser loads. Let me stick a hello world in here. Let me go live. Perfect. And put this on a different tab so we can see. In fact, we can see what happens here in the network tab when the browser loads. It's talking to the server. It requests the HTML page. It requests the CSS styles. And these are some, like, it's trying to get an icon that doesn't exist. And this, I don't know what that is, to be honest. Once it's got those, it starts interpreting them, and it goes through the HTML file line by line, like we were kind of walking through before with the CSS, and starts applying the rules and starts transforming this into an object. The same way when you import a CSV file with Python, we've now got that data in the system. And that object is called the document object model, or the DOM. And it's how we interact with a website, and we can do all sorts of things with it. It's how clicking and typing works. It's how we can write JavaScript to edit the page, and all these interesting things that we're going to see. So I know I was talking a bit, so kind of before I move on, I just want to check in and see if folks have any questions or things that could use clarification, or things they want to add to the mix.
I have a quick question. I don't know how relevant it is, but so for HTML, we have like the head, we have the body. Are there other like parent stuff that we need to know about, or is it just like head and body is pretty much it?
It's a great question. So yeah, technically speaking, the parent of the tree is the very first node, which is this HTML element here, right? But you're right that we always have to have these two, and that they're always going to be the first two children. And that's basically it. Those are kind of like the only required things. There's maybe the HTML doc type, but I'm not even sure if we need that anymore. So this is all you need. And Raphael, if I was oversimplifying, please let me know.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Nathan, what's up?
yes, hi. So I had a question about, I guess, the div tags. Is there like a hierarchy of certain tags or a best practice? The thing that was confusing me before was like the section tags versus the div tags. This DOM thing it's sorting a lot of stuff out for me. So I guess right now, when would I use the section tags? Is it best practice to break up like all of your containers or rows into sections, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for folks who don't know, like a relatively recent addition to HTML is a tag called a section tag. And this touches on two things here, because you asked two questions in one, and they're both really good. One is like, what's the hierarchy of my HTML document, like of this tree? And the other is kind of like, what's the deal with this tag called section? There are a bunch of other ones they've added, and how should I use them? I'm going to start with just the tree because it's the simpler one. From the perspective of the DOM and an HTML document as a tree, every element, whether it's a section or a body or a head or a link, is a node in the tree. And from that perspective, they're all exactly the same. These are all nodes in a tree. And the hierarchy in terms of kind of the tree and the document is just however we build it, right? Like if I wanted to, I could do this. Let's just put another div there. And from the perspective of an HTML document and building a tree and thus constructing the DOM, pretty much anything we can do is fine. The two big things being we have to start with HTML and we have to have a head and a body. And then all this stuff has to go inside the body. So that's kind of answer to the part one of your question. Part two is like, what the heck is this section tag and what do I do with it? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. The short answer is section and a bunch of other tags like that are relatively newer tags that introduce more semantic information like we were talking about yesterday. So if you have a long news article, you might use the section tag because it can help search engines who are doing search engine optimization. And like, when you see parts of articles in Google search results, and also screen readers for folks who are blind and for other accessibility issues. The short answer in terms of what to do right now, if you want to use those things, go for it, but don't worry about it for learning purposes is what I'd say. They're not even widely adopted across the industry yet, though they should be. And Raphael, I'm curious too if you have any more thoughts on those things. Okay.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. So yeah, I've not really used the semantic tags a whole lot, to be honest. They are exactly the same as a div, you know, a section or article or a side tags.
Yeah.
It's mechanically the same as a div. They just mean different things.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't ever think about them when I'm building my HTML. I just reach for a div and then it looks how I want it to, and then I move on. I guess it would be good to use a section tag. It would be more meaningful. But like practically speaking, in my HTML, I'm probably going to have like a div with class equals section, which like if you're reading it over, that's kind of similarly meaningful to just using a section tag. So maybe it's not as good for screen readers or other like automated programs that try to make sense of your page. I'm not really sure what the experience is like there, but I don't think there's really a huge push to use the semantic tags. Like they're neat to learn about, but I don't see them very commonly. I've never been really like encouraged to use them, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. I'm on the same page. And I don't think they weren't widely used in my previous roles. I think it's good to know about. It's certainly good to be able to talk about them for interview purposes. Again, for stuff right now that I think falls into the icing on the cake category. But yeah, that's a really good question, and thank you, Nathan.
So just to clarify,
yeah.
So the div tags, section tags, A tags, all those things, there's no particular hierarchy as long as they're in your body other than how you want to actually structure your page.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I mean, like when we're talking about like with the tree, the hierarchy of the tree is going to be whatever shape the tree has. And that's kind of determined just by how we write this document. And like you said, there's nothing special about a section tag. It's kind of like it has this semantic meaning that's kind of in addition and kind of separate to the hierarchy of like the DOM and stuff like that. And just
Yeah, they used to really overuse like div and title, and they'd be like, this is an article, and then this is a header, and then this is a section. And so they came up with these extra tags to also help with like parsing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's the history. Like when these things didn't exist, it was all div and with like class names and stuff. And so again, like especially if you're like a newspaper or the group of people responsible for like determining the future of HTML, then there are good reasons maybe to start introducing those things. I want to point out with the DOM, the document object model, what we have right here in DevTools is like a visual tool for directly interacting with the DOM. Here's our tree. Each of these elements is a node. And this gets built when the browser reads and interprets an HTML page. And so that's why like you can even like edit stuff in here. Which can be useful when you're like experimenting with stuff. And then what happens is we've just, through DevTools, interacted with the document object model, which has then gone and changed. We've changed the DOM. And that's what the browser looks at to render. That HTML file is still the same. And when I reload the page, it grabs that HTML and we go back to where we were. Does that make sense to folks? Because I feel like that touches on like a really key concept here. And we're going to see more of this as we do this with JavaScript. Okay, cool.
So,
I'm going to take, yeah,
Adam,
yeah.
so are you saying that when we do things in JavaScript, we're not in any way altering the HTML file? It's just what appears in the browser is altered. Is that correct?
Yeah, 100% correct. Like, I wish I could draw a diagram right now, but I can write a list. Sorry. So this is, I was kind of walking through this. These are kind of the basic version of, and pretty accurate version of what happens. Browser fetches an HTML file, it interprets it to build the DOM. It uses the DOM to render the page for us, the user, not the viewer, sorry, the user, to see and interact with. And then when I do this, you're exactly right. I'm not modifying the HTML page. I am modifying the DOM. Yeah, that was a really good question. And in fact, if we look here, there's a bunch of junk here. The sources tab lets us look at the actual files that the browser has fetched from the server. This is a bunch of stuff that VS Code inserted for its live server feature, but here's that hello world div. That file is totally unchanged. This is all, imagine importing a CSV file in Python and you stick that data into, like, you know, you create an instance of a class of something with that data, and then you change that class. The CSV file is unchanged. Yeah, it's a really good question. Any other questions along that line? Cool. All right, let's do it. Now let's see how we can write some JavaScript to interact with the DOM. And I think I want to add a couple more things so we have something a little more interesting to look at. I want to add an input. And I want to add a button. And I'm not going to have the button do anything yet. And all I'm going to do now is I just want to make sure that my HTML is correct, that we're looking good, which we are. I wish I could make, there we go. I'll make this a bit bigger so we can see it. And again, we can see what's going on here. And so every time I click, the fact that this focus happens, that this is all from the browser, you know, interacting with the DOM and then changing what's rendered on the page and modifying the DOM. And we're going to see how this happens and how this happens with DOM events in just a moment. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to throw in a little JavaScript. I think I'm going to start in the console. This is the DOM. This is the whole thing right here. And the console, for those of you who don't know, is a little tool that lets you write JavaScript and then run it within the context of your browser. And we can see, you know, exactly what we see here. And you can do everything that you normally would do in JavaScript here. If we wanted to have it print the DOM to like a giant string or object of some sort, it might do that. But what I want to do is the DOM, you can go to the Mozilla developer doc site and you'll find a whole like API definition for the DOM. Again, think of it, it's exactly like a giant class with like 1,000 methods. And one of the most useful ones is get element by ID. And I actually have to go back and look at the ID of my input. So again, just to kind of make real explicit what I'm doing here, I'm sorry that this is so big. I have this, man, how do I get rid of this? I have this input element and I added an attribute ID to it. And now I can write some JavaScript that gets it, which is awesome. And I can do something even better. I can get the value of that placeholder. I can change the value of that placeholder. Does that make sense to folks? Let me check in here too, because now we're about to jump and start writing this JavaScript in our HTML file. And how's the pace of this? This
Also,
is too
just
slow,
to clarify,
too fast.
the dot placeholder, you're not actually accessing the data that the user is putting in, right? You're just accessing the default value within that search bar, correct?
Yes, and that's a great question. The placeholder attribute for an input field determines like what you see in here until someone types. I believe.
So would you still have to add to like get the value that they put in there? Would that still be a, shoot, what is it called? A listener or whatever it's called? Like on click, you get that value, or is it still one of these?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We are going to write a listener that listens for when that input changes. And the logic for our listener will use this same approach to get that value. So it's kind of two steps. Listen for when the input changes and then get the value of what the user typed. And I can actually demonstrate step 2 right now, and we can get to step 1. Did that make sense?
So they don't have to click submit. You didn't click submit on that, right?
Right. That's a really good point, Alicia, actually. And let me talk about that real quick. And this touches again on what the DOM is. So we've got two things here, right? We've got, and let me jump to the elements. We've got an input element that's a text field, and we've got a button. The button right now, I haven't added anything, so it actually doesn't do anything. And this isn't like, the browser does a little bit of stuff when we put things inside a form element, but we're not even there yet. So honestly, this button is sort of like a dead button at the moment. And you're totally right that like the standard behavior is you click the submit button and it sends whatever the user types somewhere and then does something with it. And now we're kind of breaking that down into its pieces. And what the document object model lets us do is interact with each part of the document. So by using Java, and JavaScript is the way that you basically interact with the DOM, because JavaScript is the language of the browser and the language of the web. For historical reasons, basically. So like what we can do here is, again, just directly interact with this element, and everything about what you see on the page is captured in the DOM, whether this is focused or not, the highlight color, like I can't keep it focused, but I think, let's see if I can focus on it. No, I don't. Do you know off the top of your head, Raphael, what the?
I was
don't
gonna
know.
guess what you just did, honestly.
Yeah. It might also be weird because we're doing it in DevTools. Maybe it doesn't want to shift the focus, but you can like.
Hold up,
Sorry,
actually,
go ahead.
Can you call .trigger? That does that method exist? And can you?
No.
No.
what we can do is we could see yeah, I think I'm gonna pause there because I tend to run kind of long, and I can tell I'm just gonna go down a big digression if I keep experimenting with that. But I think the input is really instructive, and that was a really good question, Alicia, because again, it's like now we're kind of shifting from thinking about the browser and the page that we see as like a web page to like a giant living program that we can interact with and modify and control every aspect of with the model, our document object model of what we're seeing here.
So is this outside of the scope of today's lecture to ask you, even though it's not connected to a server, is it outside of today's scope to ask you to write out the JavaScript that would actually grab the value submitted? Because you said it's not dot value because you could just keep changing the text in there, but the one that you click submit on is the one that you want.
Right, you mean like how does that information get to a server and what does that code look like?
Yeah, I mean, like, how do you grab that submitted value that was
Yeah.
sent to the server? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. We're gonna see more of those pieces for sure in a little bit. We're gonna see kind of everything up to how it actually goes to the server.
Okay.
But yeah, but like, you know, even I'm like 99.9% certain that what the browser itself does with like an HTML form and stuff, if we have it all set up when we hit the submit button, is the browser is using this exact same approach. It's calling some method to get the element that we want and then looking at the value property. So it, in a very fundamental sense, like this is the JavaScript that's used to get that value. And then we'll start seeing in a couple minutes how to link that up to happen when the user clicks on a button and the kind of interactivity that you're talking about. And we can change it. We can really do anything. Okay, cool. I want to keep rolling, and I'm going to kind of start adding a bit more of that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the style sheet because we don't need it. I'm going to add a script tag here to write some JavaScript, which is going to be messy. Sorry, I'm using a little timer to try to not run crazy long, because as you folks can tell, I get excited about this stuff. Let's see how this works. I just want to do a quick console log to make sure that this is all doing what I expect. So I'm going to pop back over here. So this comes, and in fact, it shows us where it's coming from in, when the browser interprets the HTML page, if it runs into a script element, that tells it, hey, what you see inside here is JavaScript, so interpret it as JavaScript. And so when we load the page, it does that and runs that code. Does that make sense to folks? Excuse me. And let me pause real quick. Does anyone have any questions around this stuff we're covering? It's not that I don't want to look at stuff further afield, but I just want to make sure that we stay on point.
Oh, I have a question. In your HTML document, when you're writing your scripts, is it normal to put it in the head?
I think it can be normal to put the script tag in the head. The difference is with it in the head, the JavaScript code runs before the body is read and rendered. So it can depend on what you want to do. Yeah, that's a good question. I think the short answer is it depends. And I think for now, putting it in the head is fine. And when we get to the point where maybe we need to change that, we'll be able to change that pretty easily. But it will work just as well. It should, unless I'm totally forgetting something, putting it at the bottom of the body. And for sanity's sake, yeah, it prints again. ignore this. This is, I don't know why the browser does this, and it's not related to anything that we're doing. Yeah, that's a really good question. And it does touch on like the browser runs all this stuff top to bottom sequentially, which can have implications for certain things, but we don't have to worry about that now. And I see it doesn't like that. Okay, cool.
I just want to add a little tidbit to that.
Yeah.
The answer of where you put your scripts depends on when you want them to load. So kind of what I was taught originally was that if you need your script to load first thing before anything else loads, then you put it in the head, because like Adam was saying, the HTML file is read from top to bottom. So if you have a JavaScript file in the head, that file has to get executed before anything in the body can load. That also means that if your JavaScript file is referring to elements in the body, like you're trying to grab things by ID, that's going to fail because your JavaScript is running before the document is actually loaded. So you're trying to grab elements with JavaScript that don't exist quite yet. So yeah, if something needs to be loaded like before anything else loads, you put it in the head. But what will happen a little bit more commonly is that you want to show them the HTML and CSS as fast as possible so that it feels like your page is fast. And then you kind of let the JavaScript load in the background and just be ready after everything else. So in that case, you could put the JavaScript file at the bottom of your body section, in which case your browser gets to load all of the HTML content and show that to the user before it starts parsing the JavaScript. So that way it's maybe a slightly better user experience, that they get to see some content before the JavaScript starts doing its business.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
But more recently, what I prefer is instead of putting scripts at the end of the body, you can still put them in the head, but you use the defer keyword. So I think Craig mentioned that in the chat. Having a script with defer in the head is the same as putting it at the body. That basically means that if the script is deferred, that the browser is going to try to load all your HTML content first, and then try to run that script like in the background without blocking everything else from happening. So that's kind of touches on what I was saying yesterday about prioritizing above the fold content. You want to, let the things that the user can see load as quickly as possible. And if you think that the JavaScript file that you're loading is not essential for your user's like first 1 or 2 second impression on your website, then maybe it should be deferred instead.
Yeah, totally. Like, and actually, I think we can give a good example of like how things can fail depending on what you need to the JS to do and like where the JavaScript is running. And you make a really good point about like making sure that you're getting the browser to show stuff to the user as quick as possible. You don't want it to like spend 5 seconds downloading and running a bunch of JavaScript and the user sees a white screen for 5 seconds and then it starts rendering the HTML. I've got a function here that I think is going to be a great example of this actually. And before we see like what this does or doesn't do, does someone who hasn't spoken up yet want to take a crack at this and maybe like walk through like what lines 7 through 10 are doing and explain it?
So I'm assuming the function would start and then it would go name input. So it would access the document. It would get the element by ID, just like we did in the console.
Yeah.
So there you have the ID of input name. So then it's whatever we actually put inside of the input.
Yeah.
And then input value is going to be equal to the value. So then that would be the result of what we put after we submit. And then when you put console.log, I think you have that text input values with the colon, but you have value there. Do you mean to put name input value since you set it to that variable? Because technically value would be undefined, wouldn't it?
I do. Thank you. Value, you're totally right. Thank you very much, Francisco. Yeah, beautiful. That's awesome. And as long as we're doing this, when we go to the browser and the browser fetches this page and reads through the HTML and runs all this, when this show greeting function runs, what are we going to see in the console?
Whatever was typed into that bar.
In
Input value
theory,
plus.
in theory, yes. And that's the goal of this. And it's not quite a trick question, but it's a little bit of a leading question, because we have this error instead that says cannot read property of null. So what is the thing? Null means something doesn't exist. What does not exist that we're trying to read here? What's happening here?
Is it because we haven't
there was
put
no
anything
input
into
yet.
the input?
It's a great question. You know what? In fact, let me go ahead just for the moment. I'll just change this to what was the name? Was it? Can someone help me? Was it placeholder? Is that correct?
Yep.
Thank you. Let's just change it to placeholder and see what happens. Okay, so we still don't get a placeholder. So the question is, so let's walk through this real quick. And this touches on exactly what Raphael was saying. And the key thing to remember again is, like writing any program, when the browser's reading through an HTML document and building the DOM, it does it step by step, top to bottom. So it starts here, says, all right, we got a head element. Awesome, let's create it. My page has a title. Let's display it. Oh, we've got some JavaScript. Let's print hello to the console. Let's write this function. Yeah, Daniel got it in the chat. This function does all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. I call this function. All right, what should I do? Well, let me access the document. I can do that. Let me find an element by ID. And in fact, let's just do this. And as Daniel pointed out, this is where we fail, because we haven't gotten to this point in the code where that input element is created. And we can see, I think that should, unless I did something wrong, we should be getting, interesting. Oh, you know what? So this right here, line 9, it's printing something, but it's printing null because it's trying to grab something that doesn't exist. So that just returns null and we print null. And then on the next line where it tries to do like null dot placeholder, it freaks out. And just to kind of flip the script here, let's not call this function here. We can define it there, that's fine. Let's call it here after the body has loaded. And unless I screwed up,
I don't know if
you know,
you
it may
saved your
not.
HTML.
I'm sorry?
I don't know if you saved your HTML file before you checked it.
I think I did. I think it may be the script tag. Well, yeah, I think it's just script tags being a little funny about having stuff in 2 different script tags. So the key thing here is that now that I'm actually calling this code after this element has been created, we have access to it. What questions do people have before we kind of move on and kind of get closer to what Alicia was pointing out about starting to connect the dots of of buttons and forms and interactivity.
So right now, the reason why it's printing name is because you're calling the placeholder in the function, correct?
Exactly. We call a method on the DOM, the document. We call this method that the document object has, get element by ID. We tell it the ID that we want, name input. Did I get that right? Input name. That returns a node in the DOM, which is just another JavaScript object and a property on that JavaScript object. The same way you have a property on a method is the placeholder. Yeah, exactly. And so like the browser, when it builds the DOM, transforms this like structured text into objects, JavaScript objects, and throws in some methods and things like that. Yeah, that's a really good question. Other questions? Okay, cool. What I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to connect a couple dots, walk through that quickly, and then we'll take a break and we'll dig more into modifying the DOM and events, DOM events, which is how all this happens. Because I am running, we're doing okay, but I do tend to run a bit long. So I want to do a couple things. Instead of the placeholder, I want to get the value. I want to go back to kind of what we were doing. I'm going to leave this here. I'm going to leave both of the console logs there just as helpers for me. I find it really helpful to leave console logs when programming something new because it lets me see what's working and what's not working. And in fact, if I go here and I run this, I see this, but there's no value because I haven't typed anything. I type something, but that function already executed, so we don't see anything. So now we need to do exactly what Alicia was saying, and we need to hook up our function to our button. So a couple things need to happen. First thing is the button, really everything, all elements can have an on-click attribute. And it's annoying, and this is part of why when we see React, it's so great. Like, it kind of sucks to be putting like JavaScript code as a string inside this attribute here. But essentially what I'm doing is now we're using the DOM. And part of what the DOM does and what it knows is, hey, if an element has an on-click attribute, I need to listen for when the user clicks on it, which works with something called events, which we'll talk about shortly. And when it's clicked on, I need to call this function. And when I call this function, I want to give it information about what was clicked and maybe some other stuff. In this case, we don't even really need that because our function kind of does everything we need. So let's see. I've got all this. And now let's see what happens. And it's cool. We're cooking. Every time we click on this, it calls that function, which does that work. This is that other print line statement that I think maybe now is a good time to get rid of. I'll leave it here in the notes so it's there for people to see. You know, I need to click on it, but now we've got this hooked up. What questions do people have? Dalton, the while loop, because I'm running from a server, is that about like loading the HTML page, you mean?
I just mean like, so when we were doing like say the def grandma challenge, you would have to put a while loop so you could keep continually putting new inputs, but I'm assuming you don't need to do that because it's like always running on the server.
Do you mean so that like when I type, every time I type a new letter, it changes? We see a printout of it?
Not every time you type a new letter, but every time you type submit, because like if we were just doing this in a terminal and you did everything you did now, like you would only be able to, you'd have to run the code every time you wanted to
Right.
see. So I'm assuming,
Right. That I see exactly what you're saying, and that makes a lot of sense. And so essentially, I don't know if the browser is using a while loop, but I think we can assume it is, and it's certainly good for purposes of talking about it. The browser itself is essentially running a while loop. It doesn't quite work that way, but the browser's got some code that's always running and always listening. And in a little bit, we're going to see what it's listening for. What actually happens is when I click this button, and actually, in fact, let me go ahead and do that. And we can see kind of some of the work that the browser does for us. That's a really good question. What did I do wrong? Bear with me. I just want to get this working, and then we can walk through it and make it look nicer. Maybe I don't think that's right either. Could use a little help here, actually, Raphael, or if anyone knows what I need to do to get the events.
Can you just pass event into the call right there?
I think you're right. Yeah, thank you. Awesome. Okay. So Dalton, you raised a really good point. Like, how is this working? There has to be something running in the background, whether it's a while loop or not. The browser has a whole bunch of stuff running in the background. That's part of what it does when it builds a DOM and part of what a browser does. And what it has running in the background are what are called event listeners. And without kind of going into all that too much, and we'll go into it in a bit, part of what the DOM does, it's not just about interacting with these nodes, it's about handling user input. And the way that the DOM does this is with a model called like the event model, where basically every time the user clicks anywhere or types or does something, that input is spat out by the DOM to itself as what's called an event, which is just a fancy word for an object. Honestly, it's an object in JavaScript. You'd write it as like an object or a mat, like maybe like a dictionary or something in Python. And there is a part of the DOM always listening in a while loop. And because of the way that it's built and the way HTML works, it kind of does a lot of the connecting for us. You could totally write some code from scratch in Python or JavaScript that works in a similar way. This just connects a lot of those dots for us. And we can see this event thing, it has all this crazy information. And this is just a JavaScript object. You know, you can print it out as a string. It has so much information. Source element, where did this event come from? It came from a button. Then all this crazy information about the button. Target is similar to source element. And I'll come back there. Like everything you could ever possibly want to know about the event. And in fact, part of what it has is if we go to the event object and the target property on that and the value property on that, that's how we get the information that of what the user typed. Like when I type in here, every time I type a letter, there are other events being fired that the DOM is handling. And in fact, document get elements by ID, input name, add, let's see, is that right? Yep. add event listener. DOM keyboard listener. Keyboard event. So this is what you will be doing all day when you're working. You'll be Googling stuff all the time. Every time you type key down, key press, key up. So I just want to skim through here and like, I want to find the events. It's a key down event. I'm gonna, in fact, DOM listen for key press event. I'm gonna make my life even simpler and find a Stack Overflow or some tutorial post that explains how to do this, because I know about 2/3 of it, but I'm blanking. Beautiful. And this is what I want. So the key, by the way, like Googling stuff is good. You should be doing it. The trick, I think my rule is I don't want to write code that I don't understand, because that's dangerous and it ultimately just slows you down in your career. Google stuff, borrow other people's code to your heart's content, but you got to understand what it's doing. Also, because a lot of the time people are wrong. So I see here, add event listener, key down. So this is great. This is going to work for the whole document, in fact. And I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to do it like this. I want to make sure if it was upper or lowercase. And I'm just going to start with that. And now, yeah. And now you can see, in fact, what's happening here. There's this whole event thing printed out. Luckily, they show the key bit here. There's a property on this object called key. And let me actually show this real quick, and then I think it might be a good time for a break. Let's add another input. Let's not give it an ID. What did I do wrong? Of course. There we go. We have 2 inputs now. Let's add this listener again. Because I added the listener to the document, it's going to listen to the whole document. I could also do document get element by ID. Actually, I'm not going to go there, but you can specify where you put the listener, or you can listen everywhere. So I think after this, it's probably a good point to take a break. And after the break, I think we will look more at events. Before we break, what questions do people have related to this stuff?
Can you just go back to your file real quick?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah,
did
what
you
other
put
questions?
Where did you put
Sorry.
the listener?
Yeah, so I actually didn't write the listener in the file. Yeah, it's over here.
Okay.
I'll make sure when I share my notes that I include examples of all this stuff. So yeah, and you know what? I'll just throw this in. I'll throw this in the chat real quick, just the Zoom chat. How are people doing, by the way? Let me get a quick like emoji and some feedback. Like, how's the pace? Too much, too slow? Time for a break? Is this making sense? Would something be helpful? Okay, I see a couple people who are like, "Oof, this is a lot." And this is a lot. Like, we are definitely drinking from the fire hose. The good news, by the way, is like events and this stuff that we're seeing, like this is a core concept. Like it's going to be valuable for your whole career and in other places too. And it makes sense that it's a lot. Honestly, it's pretty complex stuff. It's not like the DOM and like events are like what you learn in like your first 2 CS courses as an undergrad. So because of the nature of the boot camp, we cover a lot of ground. Any other questions or comments before we break for, let's call it 10? Raphael, what do you think? Should we do 10 or 15 minutes?
Let's do 15. Well, a little bit less than 15. I like coming back at round times. So let's come back at 11:05.
Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah, let's do that. Let's break now so we can enjoy our break. Feel free to throw a question in the chat and let's come back at 11:05, at which point we'll learn more about events. And
Cool.
Raphael, could you please just stop the recording as I can't?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Terrence.
Gotta start over. I'm just kidding.
That's going to be the beginning of the recording. This is all, anyway, Raphael, thank you. And Terrence, it's a really good question. And jumping back real quick, because I know we're jumping around between languages a lot. Can someone just quickly walk through what this JavaScript is doing?
It's getting the,
yeah.
Okay. So it's
No, yeah.
getting the document, and then it's getting an element from that document, which is called my button, which I think is a class or an ID, one of the two. And then it's just adding an event listener called onClick, I think.
Yep, beautiful. And our editor can help us a lot here. Like, it doesn't quite tell us this, but the document is a JavaScript object, or maybe even a JavaScript class with a bunch of methods or functions on it, right? And so we're calling a method on our document, and it tells us this here. This is the argument for our method. JavaScript lets us do something called method chaining, where like I could do this, like let my button equal this. I can do this, which is totally legitimate, and it has the advantage of being a bit more readable, especially when you're getting familiar with JavaScript. And this is just a shorthand way of doing that. Like, we've gotten the element, the node from the DOM, and now it's got another method on it called add event listener. And we haven't talked about this a lot in JavaScript, but the same way we saw with generators in Python, where you pass a function in as an argument to another function, we actually pass in 2 arguments to this add event listener. One is a string that has the name of the event, and the other is a function. And can I just, have people seen this function notation in JavaScript?
I think we covered it.
Okay, cool. And just to review, the other way to write it would be like this. Just stick a function in there. And that's something we can totally go over more later. And I could I'm just gonna copy this event, and let's just say event listener B, and here let's say event listener A. And Why did that not, I did something wrong. Oh, this probably
So-
needs to be E.
None of the names of events have on in them,
Ah,
but that's how we write the HTML attribute for handling those events is on and then event name.
yeah, thank you. Thank you, Raphael.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is why you folks are just going to be spending half your professional lives Googling things.
Yeah,
So
I
we have
only know that
two-
because I've taught this like 7 times. That's not something I memorized just from being a front-end developer.
Yeah. 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 No one memorizes all this stuff. And I don't have the second event listener set up quite right, but that's okay. It's more I wanted to illustrate a point and I diverged a little. But to go back to your question, Terrence. So on click is an attribute that we can add to any element, to a button, to a div or whatever. And this does all the work of setting up an event listener. Like it tells the DOM to do this for that element and call this code. And this is another way to do that same thing. The name of the event is click. And so to circle back, I can use the DOM to click on stuff because I can use it to control everything. So it's confusing because there's an event with a name click, and then there's this method that's click. And then there's that attribute on click. Does that make sense? As much sense as it's going to make at this point in time?
I think so, but to clarify, so
Yeah.
onClick is onClick is a function, but just click itself is just like a quick method, a built-in method.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and this is where it gets confusing. We've got like two worlds, the world of the HTML file and the world of the DOM. In the world of the HTML file, we have this element attribute named onClick. What that does is when the browser builds the DOM, it says, hey, I have to listen for an event that's named click, which is just the string. And when that happens, I need to call this function. And then it is a little confusing because every element, there is also like in the world of the DOM, this guy right here is a button. And it's an object, and it's got a method called click that we can do. So it is a little confusing. The short answer is onClick is how you tell it what to do when it gets clicked. And click is to trigger the click itself.
All right, that's more understandable.
Yeah, and I apologize. I know I'm kind of circling around a bit. And honestly, it's helpful to have like a reference guide out because as you can see, like it's hard for me to remember this stuff. And I think events are like a big concept. Like you're not meant to totally get it right away. And there is a lot of like naming and it's confusing. And the more you do it, the easier it gets. And I want to go ahead now and build a form, which is actually going to put all of these things together.
Adam, real quick before you do that, would
yeah.
you mind going back to your HTML file?
Yeah.
Okay, because it looks like right now you have all of your JavaScript within your HTML, which I'm pretty sure you more often you have it in its own separate file. So is line 16 through 24, is that the only part that would be in a separate, or is it 15 through 32 that would be in a separate JavaScript file? And then just on line 13, the onClick would basically say, go grab that function from the JavaScript file, or what all would you have to change if you had this in a separate JavaScript file?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me just go ahead and do that. And I think that'll be good for us to see. Please forgive the file name. Again, I'm just kind of going for clarity. I think we should actually name this like index.js would probably be correct. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all of this. And so Alicia, you're correct that all the JavaScript we have in this HTML file is inside this scripts tag. It pretty much stays unchanged. I'm going to add a console log up here. Because this is going to help me confirm that everything is working the way I think. And I am going to, for the moment, just comment this stuff out so that in case I make a mistake, I still have it. But once I have everything working, I'm going to, maybe I'll just leave that as an example, or delete it. And now we need to, in fact, include this, which again, we do by, we need to tell the browser, hey, I need you to go grab this file. And equals, I want to say.
Script is what you're looking for here.
Thank you.
I mean, script tag.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You need a
As
script
opposed to
tag.
link.
Links are just for.
It's not a, I'm so
CSS.
sorry. Yeah. And then source.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Raphael. And that just points to, again, it's like when you're not doing this stuff every day, you know, there's just too many details to remember. So as Raphael was pointing out, we still use a script tag, but instead of putting our JavaScript inside the script tag, we, and it looks like,
You got like half a comment there or something.
yeah. I thought it was commented out I see a moment ago.
Yeah, why is that not working?
I'm gonna just,
Isn't the script so on the script? Oops.
it's okay. I'm just doing a little,
Anyways, there's supposed to be a closing caret and then script close.
Yeah.
Or
Gotta
just
close the
control
script tag.
slash.
Yeah, so you have closing caret and then, right? So close caret on the first script and then you do the script. Yep. Slash script. Yep. So that red slash is just excessive. There you go.
it should be the same thing unless they do something funny with the script tag.
Yeah, scripts are not self-closing. It's easy for me
Oh.
to forget that because you
Got
don't usually put content inside of them. But yeah, they need an end tag.
Thank you. Yeah, that's just one of the annoying things. Yeah. Alicia, that's a great question. And it took me a minute to get there, but kind of here's the answer to your question. And in fact, let me go ahead and do a split screen. Perfect. Let's put this here. And we'll get rid of this. And how do I get rid of line numbers? Let's see, does VS Code have like a Zen mode? Yeah. Beautiful. So that is hopefully a little easier to read for people on the screen share. So we've got these two files. And you know, there's no importing, there's no relationship between the two, and that is confusing with writing HTML and JavaScript and CSS. When we write this one, we just have to know what exists in the HTML file. And we use a script tag to load the page. And we can in fact see this happening in the browser. If I refresh, we can see that now. Oh, I apologize. It's hard to see, but it is the same way the browser moves through and does all this work. When it gets to this point, it says, oh, we've got JavaScript. Oh, I need to go grab and download this file. And I stuck this console log in here specifically so that we could be sure that it's being read. And now everything should kind of be working.
So also, I want to verify, can you go back really quick?
Yeah.
To your, so on your index HTML on where it says, where does
I
it
should have
say?
left the line
You're
numbers.
you're on, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll
But you're on click right there where it says to run the function show greeting. So I want to clarify, this is two different methods of doing essentially the same thing, because lines 12 through 17 on your JavaScript file are doing the same thing, but you wouldn't need the on click whatever, right? Because you haven't named that as a function. You're just saying, do this on this when this event happens, but it's not an actual function. Is that right?
You are right. This right here is, it's two ways of doing the same thing. And in fact, we could do this.
And so like if you got rid of that on click part with the show greeting on your index HTML, the event listener B would still run, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
And which
Yeah,
one's
that's a
more,
really good point.
so is
And we
it,
can see that. I'm not sure what ran twice. I'm sorry, go ahead.
is it very often that, because I could totally understand like on click run this function. How often is it that you have that set up versus kind of like a, this document option that seems to kind of just be like in the ether of do this thing when it's clicked? Which one's more common, or do you see both of them a lot?
That's a really good question. And by the way, what this does is it uses this under the hood, which I think is valuable to know. You're going to end up using both, but for clicking on stuff and for things like forms, you're going to be using on click this way more, writing it in the HTML. You'll end up doing this for other stuff, but this is the thing to get comfortable with first, I think, and that we'll use more of. And if you have to choose between the two, do it by putting on click in your HTML as an attribute on the element.
Okay, thanks.
For sure. Yeah, that was a really good question.
I just want to add on real quick. I think it's kind of a funny question versus, having on click equals function or add event listener. I feel like the industry has kind of come full circle on this question. Like before I was coding, I know just setting on click attributes was common. And then when I was learning front end in 2013, 2014, that was a very bad practice. You're supposed to use add event listener to be more organized about how you add event listeners. And there are a variety of reasons why that's better in certain contexts. But nowadays, in the context of using React, we've kind of come full circle all the way around again. And so now we're going to be adding event handlers using on-click attributes instead of using add event listener. I think it's kind of funny.
Yeah, there's so much change and churn, and React changed a lot of stuff for sure. I think by the time I came in and started doing front end, React and this other front end framework, Angular, were well established enough that you were going to be using one or the other. So I just got very comfortable using those. And then this stuff, we'll see React, when you're building something like React, you use this stuff all the time. And Raphael's totally right. In the end of the day, it's always going to depend on context and the code base. I think that especially if you're writing forms, I would do it this way. And I think for now, for learning, starting with this way is going to be, yeah, for me at least, that's where I would lean. As you can tell, it's not like there's any one ultimate answer to these things, because even in class, we're kind of talking about it, and there's like all these nuances and stuff.
Wouldn't worry about it too much. I think as we get closer to building real projects, it'll be more apparent to you which style is going to be more useful.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like, and if you're like building your first form, like do it this way. It's going to be whichever way makes it like easier to be organized at the end of the day. And in that vein, I think I want to roll on a bit so I can make sure that we see a form and a couple other things that kind of come out of that as a result. And that is a really good question, Alicia. Thank you. I want to start. I'm just going to throw a form tag in here to begin with. And I'm going to kind of do my sanity check. Make sure that I'm seeing what I expect. There's a form. Nothing's really happening yet. Though something interesting just happened. So this is kind of part of the magic of a form. Like a form, like the same way when we add that on-click attribute to an element in HTML, we get to take advantage of all this stuff that the DOM has set up for us. Forms work the same way. Like when we add this form element, we're telling the browser, hey, there's inputs. The user is going to be typing stuff, clicking on drop downs. There's going to be a submit button. There's like a standard concept of a form. And part of that, as you mentioned way earlier, Alicia, is like once we have that information, we need to send it somewhere. And like the classic thing that you do is the browser needs to send the data in that form to some other computer on the internet, and that's what we call a server. That's all that a server is, just another computer somewhere else that is sort of the one designated to like receive the information from the client. The client is like what the user uses. The server is what we call the back end, where like the data and the logic and stuff lives. The server is there to serve the client. And we can see that behavior here. I haven't even done anything with the form, but the page refreshes when I click on it, right? And the reason it does that is because the way that the web was originally set up, you can't really do much once a page loads. And if I need to send data somewhere, I need to make an HTTP request to send that data, and then I also have to refresh the page. That's like traditionally how a browser works. And we don't have this doing anything at the moment. You can see like stuff gets run and reloaded, but it's not really doing anything. Let me open up the JavaScript and having it start to do stuff. First, I'm going to comment a couple things out because we don't need them, and I don't want to clutter it up too much.
While you're wrangling some text over there, I just want to add a quick note. I just want to point out that there was a time on the internet before we had HTML, CSS, before JavaScript. So like the web did work without JavaScript. There was a way to submit data to servers without JavaScript. And so forms were how we did it. And that's why forms have so much automatic default behavior. We're not going to get in depth in what exactly the forms are doing automatically by default. I might talk about that a little bit more tomorrow, actually. But the point is that the form element is perfectly capable of sending data to a server without JavaScript, which is why it does all this stuff automatically when you click the submit button. But as developers, we want to take control of that behavior. And so that's what we're going to see now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very well put. Yeah, there's so much history because this stuff was designed like, and was never meant to, like Google Maps, no one was imagining Google Maps existing as something in a browser when people came up with this stuff. And it's all relatively like young technology. And it is weird and confusing seeing all this stuff, but it's really valuable too. Like in 5 years, 10 years, there are going to be all these more layers on top of all this stuff, but you folks will like still have like seen and learned a lot about like the very fundamentals of how the web works. So if I haven't totally screwed up here, when I click submit, yeah, awesome. I'm going to comment. I'm going to comment these out real quick so we can just see. Let me show you what I did. All I did was I added this attribute on submit. Kind of like with click, this means that when, I'll step back actually. So this attribute on submit, and then I put some JavaScript in here. And like on click, like the same way that we have JavaScript in here for the on click attribute, we can put JavaScript in here. And I'm just putting a console log statement just so we can see. And we can see what happens is when I click on this button, we see that, but then it goes away because the page gets refreshed. So the browser hooks all these pieces together for us for free because this is inside a form. If I take this button outside the form, that's not going to happen, I don't think. Yeah, nothing happens. And the way the browser does this is with methods on the DOM, on the document object model, exactly like we were seeing. We were talking about events. There's an event named submit, and doing this is very similar to like, you know, document, add event, listener, submits. And in fact, let's console log, second form submit. So that's totally misspelled. And I misspelled listener too.
You might also want to select a form element.
Oh, I might.
I don't know if
do
you can
that.
submit the document.
I don't know either. We're gonna find out. That's a good call. Okay, it actually did work.
Okay. Yeah, I learned.
Yeah, and it doesn't work again. But so, and this goes back to what, like Terrence, what you were saying before, and your point, Alicia. Attributes like this, where it's like we're telling the DOM, hey, listen for something and do something when something happens, are all using events under the hood. And the events have names, and we can kind of see there's a format here, right? Like on click, and the name of the event is click. On submit, and the name of the event is submit. And we haven't done anything useful with the form yet. We haven't gotten the data or anything, but I just kind of wanted to walk through this. And I think this is a really good time to pause and ask questions and check in with folks. What questions do people have? What's on people's minds? Is there anything that folks would like me to review again? And remember, if you're thinking it, someone else is too, I promise. Are we just kind of fading because it's like 11:35 and we're covering crazy amounts of stuff on Zoom? Is there a little bit of, I mean, I feel a little bit of that energy.
I have a quick question. I don't know if it's like jumping ahead, but so when with the form tag, when you submit it, where is it sending that information, or do you have to specify that in the JS file?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Thank you, Michael. By default, it sends it to the same server that it got all the other files from, the HTML file, the JavaScript file, the CSS file. There's a term origin. Without going into it too much, basically by default, the browser expects your HTML file, your JavaScript file, your CSS file, all to come from the same server. And if it doesn't, it says, hold on a minute, like some random person is giving me JavaScript. This could be insecure. And so by default, when you hit form submit, it'll send it back to that same server that it got the stuff from. It's origin. Yeah, that's a really good question. Cool. I'm gonna kind of pivot off of that just to demonstrate grabbing some data from that form and what that looks like. And then that will kind of lead into our next topic about event. It's called bubbling. So I think we'll look at this. We'll take like a 5-minute break and then we'll dive into event bubbling. While I'm typing this little bit of code out, are there any other questions or things on people's mind?
Yeah, I have one question. I don't know
Yes,
if
sir.
I'm misinterpreting how the live server works for VS Code, but is there any difference on how you're doing things like because of the live server, the VS Code one versus like looking at the website?
That's a great question. The short answer is no. We wouldn't really have to write a lot of code differently. Live server just saves me a lot of like every time, and actually this touches on something really valuable. All of these files, when I'm editing them, they live on quote unquote the server. VS Code is giving me a little server that's reading these files. Every time I change it, I would like have to maybe restart the server if without live code.
Right, I was thinking of that because you were showing something that refreshed, and like in cases that refresh when the data changes. I was thinking like maybe there was a difference because it was a live server, it was on live server versus.
Yeah, honestly, live server just makes life a whole lot easier for development because it handles refreshing stuff and keeping stuff in sync. It's just things that we'd have to like maybe do manually instead and refresh the page. You know, like live server does a little bit of magic so that when I change this, normally I change this, the browser doesn't know that. The browser doesn't know that because this is a file on the server. Live server is keeping a connection between the two and telling the browser, oh, I'm sorry, it's in the title, so it is doing it. Live server tells the browser, hey, go refetch the HTML file because something changed.
Right, and if like a variable changes, because like that's why I was thinking like with the live server, if you change, for example, a variable or something within the code with this event listener, would it behave different if like you don't have this automatic refresh?
I see. That's a really good question. I'm 99% sure that what live server does is actually, so exactly like we're talking about events and listeners with the DOM, live server has its own way of saying, I'm going to listen to a file. And if that file changes, I need to do something. So whenever I save the file and the contents of the file changes, live server refreshes everything. It doesn't work the same way as the DOM, but actually that's another good example of like how an event listener metaphor is useful. And this stuff, by the way, server, client, events, all this stuff was around in the 70s before browsers and stuff existed. Like it's a lot of core networking stuff too. So it's really valuable. Excuse me. Yeah, that was a great question. I think what I'm just going to do is confirm that this works. We should see something printed out with this information in a JavaScript object before the page refreshes. And we did not. Oh, yeah. So I could use a little help. I wrote this nifty function, handle form submit. How do I use it now in my HTML? Someone who hasn't participated too much yet, please tell me what to do. How about Megan? H, I can't remember your last name.
Put it into onClick.
Yeah. Yeah, very close. We can do on click or we can do on submit. And in fact, that raises a really good point. And let me get rid of on click. And I get rid of on click. And note that I still get the page refresh. This form attribute gives us an on click listener for free on this button. And that's like, because forms are such a fundamental thing that they built it into the DOM. We totally could put that method in on click, but we wouldn't get all the form data that way. And so what we will do here is handle form submit. That should do it. I might have to pass in the event. Let's see what I got wrong. Yeah, I probably have to do. Oh, double. Oh, I see. Thank you. Thank you, Raphael. Yeah. Is that? It goes by really quickly too. In fact, I'm gonna do a little undoing so I can. Yeah, I think. That should, I think that's correct. It just might happen really quickly. That
You commented out some console logs on the on one of those scripts. Does that matter at all?
I don't think so. But I should add a console log here. This way, if I screw the event up, it also goes really quickly. Maybe I need to.
Maybe we should talk about prevent default really quick.
Yeah.
Prevent that
Yeah.
default behavior so we can stay on the page.
That's a great call. Thank you, Raphael. And that, yeah, that will help with this.
Actually, right before we do that, I want to just point out one thing that can be relevant in this situation. Can you actually go back to your dev tools?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great call. Thank you.
You know about preserve log?
Oh, I
One of those
knew
gear
about
menus.
preserve log.
Can you click one of those gears?
Yeah. This is an excellent point. Thank you.
Maybe the other gear.
Oh yeah, there are two. Yep. Oh,
There we go. So
beautiful.
by default, everything in your console disappears when you refresh the page. But if you're trying to debug something that involves the page refreshing unexpectedly, that can be very hard to see any logs because they disappear when you refresh. So for debugging those kinds of issues, it's really useful to put on preserve log so that if you log something right before the page refreshes, you can still see what your log was.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Raphael. That is excellent advice. And it makes life, it's going to make my life so much easier. And that's why it's like, it's kind of like a knowledge is power thing. Like the more you learn, the easier stuff can get. And I got so wrapped up in this, I wasn't even looking at the curriculum for reference, which had the question to what I was trying to solve, which, so actually what I was just doing is what a great example of what I call like kind of banging your head against the wall programming. You kind of keep modifying something and you're just kind of throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks. It's really easy to fall into that zone. It's never productive. What's been really hard for me to learn is to stop and take a break. And just a 5-minute break of getting up and walking around 90% of the time, that does it for me. So let's confirm that this is doing something and then go to exactly what you're saying, Raphael, about prevent default. Beautiful. So we sort of have this form here. We can't really see it. I might have to.
Oh yeah, because when the page refreshes, you lose the reference. That's obnoxious. There we go.
Yeah, that's okay. This will be better. And it interesting. I would have expected.
I think the form is represented as just like a list of inputs, basically. So the first one is the name input, the second one is the color input, and I think the third one is for the submit button for some reason.
I think you're right. And I'm hoping to see this, but I think this is a perfect moment to talk about prevent default, like you mentioned. And this example is a good example. Like maybe you're debugging, or maybe you don't want the form to submit to the server. Maybe you want to make sure that blue is on a list of allowed colors and that it's not misspelled. Or maybe someone's put in a phone address or an email that you want to validate is a valid email. There's a lot of reasons why you might not want the default behavior to occur. And for that, we need to tell the DOM not to do what it normally does, which is to say, not to do its default behavior. And this event, remember, is an object that has like all sorts of stuff. And for a form, the default behavior is to send that information to the server and refresh the page. So what should happen now is the page should not refresh.
Amazing.
Awesome. And now I might as well just Google this. Yeah, you know, this is so interesting. I've never used this in my life, to be honest.
Well, actually, if the page isn't refreshing now, can you just see it in the console? If you just log the form itself?
Oh, like document, get element.
Like instead of stringifying it.
Oh, I see. Let's try that. And maybe I should just print the whole event.
Why not?
And this is a good example of simplifying too. So, okay, here's the event. And it's this big old object. And we can see exactly what you're talking about. It looks like there's just a bunch of stuff on each input. And I think, like I said, I actually have never done it this way. And to be honest, with React, I haven't used forms in a while, but this does seem to be the new way of doing it. So let's try it.
Yeah, as we get to React, you'll find that there are a few different ways maybe of sending data around. And there'll be questions about what's the best way to do it in different situations. One thing that I think is always going to be true though, is you're never going to want the default form submission behavior. Is just almost always not what you want. You're going to want to, stop that process so you can do your own logic and take control of how your data is sent where.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, like 99% of the time, if you're writing code to process forms, the first thing you're going to do is event.preventDefault.
And this is a great example too of just how complex this stuff is. You know, when I was preparing for the lecture, I didn't think I should make sure I should review how to print this stuff out from a form, because I've just kind of assumed I can do it the way that I do other stuff. And I've somehow managed to totally freeze on this, which is unfortunate. The data is here too. We can like see it hiding somewhere in the values. Let me do one more quick search. MDN form data. This, yeah, I'm just going to press pause on that. I do apologize because I would love to be showing you this information, and it in fact is in there. And it's kind of because like forms are so fundamental that it works in this way that's like a little weird and different. But for the last couple minutes, let me talk about this prevent defaults and what it does, and a little bit more about events, because that's kind of like the core thing. And what I'll do is after this wraps up, I'll take like the 5 to 10 minutes I need to when I see a couple examples, event target value. Yeah, I'm just going to pause because otherwise I'll get lost looking at chats and all the different things. Alternate way without, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah, let's try that from the lesson. Thank you guys for pointing that out. Let's try that real quick. And then if that doesn't work, we're really calling it quits. If anything, this should just go to show you that when you feel frustrated and like it's a lot, that you're correct. Just give me 1 sec here. Let's see if this works. Bingo. We don't need that. And we don't need that. And this needs to become event. And let's give this a shot. And I have a typo. And let's give this one more shot. Success, folks, thank you so much. Hopefully you learned something from watching me struggle. If not, hopefully it wasn't too much struggle. So now I can type in my name and my favorite color, and voila. By the way, this is a nice little trick if you're working with a bunch of code and you need to just change a variable name. Like I didn't want to go through each of these and change it. I could have just changed this, to be honest, but sometimes that's the quickest way. So now we're golden. And now let me talk a bit more about what event prevent default is doing and this important concept of event bubbling. So essentially, this is how events work with the DOM. When you do something like click or type, it creates an event. And we've kind of seen how that works. And we've seen how event listeners work. And the question is, how does the event get to the listener? You know what I mean? So the way that the document object model does it is it takes advantage of being a tree. And it says, hey, this event got created from this button when I clicked on it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to check my DOM tree, my node, where I'm representing this button in the DOM, and see if there are any listeners on there for a click event. If there are, great, let's call that code. If not, let's maybe, I actually don't remember if it checks like my neighbors, but it definitely then bubbles up to the parent and says, hey, let's check here. Let's see if there's a listener here for the on-click event. And if it doesn't find one, it keeps going up and up and up and up. And a quick example of that, I think, would be like this. I'm just going to throw in an on-click attribute here. And I'm just going to say clicked. And now, if I haven't totally lost the thread, we should see two things happen. Oh, interesting. Ha, speaking of the devil, I outsmarted myself. You see how it's going 3, 4. It's listening for every click. I was thinking, oh, it'll be the button, but it doesn't matter where. If I'm clicking inside here, we're going to see it. So here, and let me do this too, really quick. And this is all terrible, like, don't write code this way. Let's go for Aqua. So I wanted to do this to point out that we have two elements that are neighbors, right? This hello world and this form. The form is not a child of hello world. They're both children of this other div here. When I click on hello world, we don't see that click message because that listener I created, that on click, it's here. And the DOM does event bubbling. So it only is capturing click events that come from its children, these inputs, any click event that happens inside here. So outside there, it doesn't work. Inside here, I can click on whatever I want and we see that happen. And then if I click the submit button, we see the form submit happening as well.
Does it
And
only
in
count
fact-
it if you click into the actual objects? Like if you were to click into that random aqua space over to the right, does it count that as well?
That's a great question. The aqua space. So if I click, let's see. Yeah, I think if it's I click on any element, any node inside there.
Well, that's what I meant. Not necessarily
Yeah.
the just the div that you just added below that, but yeah, like
Yeah,
over there to the right before you
That's a
added
great
that extra
question.
part.
Yeah, it is. It is totally working. I didn't think about that. That's a good call, Maya. Thank you. Yeah. So we can do all sorts of interesting things because there are DOM events for everything. Clicking, focusing, blurring, key down, key up, key press. For scrolling, this is how scrolling works in the browser, by the way. Like every time you scroll, there's a scroll event. And so the browser's like, oh, I better scroll. And preventDefault keeps that bubbling from happening. Like we could add, like let's add another on click here.
And for clarity, stopPropagation prevents the bubbling from happening. Yeah, different methods.
Thank you.
We'll get them mixed up sometimes.
Thank you so much. So right now, we should.
Might need to double check your quote marks there.
Oh yeah. Thank you. So now if I click, we see 2 happen because the click event anywhere inside here bubbles up, hits this listener, says, okay, we're clicked. And then it keeps bubbling up to this other listener, and we see it again. Does that make sense? What questions do people have about that?
So anywhere above where you click that has an on-click event, it'll paste whatever that, or it'll do whatever that on-click listener does with the bubbling.
The bubbling goes up the tree, which I think is what you were trying to say.
Yeah, I was just trying to make sure
Yeah.
I understood.
Yep. And when it goes up the tree, going up each node of that tree, if it hits a node that has a listener for that event, then it'll print it. Like I can key press in here all day, and that's firing events all the time, but we don't have any key press event listeners like we did before, so nothing's happening. But that key press event, unless the input is doing something with it, still bubbles up. And then the last thing I want to demonstrate that Raphael pointed out that I was getting my language confused on is, let me write a quick handle click function.
So where do you put the propagation thing?
Yeah,
Because you haven't put that yet, right?
correct.
Well,
Exactly. And
the
we're going to do
propagation
that.
happens by default, is what we're describing.
The stop one, this stop propagation or whatever it's called.
Right.
Right here.
Exactly. We're going to do that right now. And I think what I want is this one needs to be handle click event like that. And let me do it once without the propagation, just to confirm that everything's working. So everything's working the way I would expect, right? And what I've done is I'm using a function that I wrote in my JavaScript file and passing the event into it. And now if on that event object, I call this method that the DOM gives us, that's part of the model of the event object called stopPropagation, we will see that there's only one listener. So propagation is kind of just a fancy word for bubbling here. We'll talk about bubbling when we talk about this. The event bubbles up from anywhere in here. It hits this guy. This method gets called, handle form submit. Excuse me. And then in there, we tell the DOM, stop bubbling this event. I don't want it to go up anymore. And so the function finishes, it prints this message, but the event doesn't bubble up. It never gets to this other on-click listener in a parent up in the DOM tree. And so we don't see that second message. And this is like the core concept of like events with the DOM. And this is how everything with the DOM and any kind of interaction you see on a web page, again, clicking, scrolling, typing, it all comes from this. So what questions and stuff do people have? And I know we're running a little long.
So while people are thinking of questions, I just want to add one little tidbit here about preventDefault and, well, with form submissions in particular. There's the question before about, the difference between clicking on the submit button versus submitting the form. And those looked really similar kind of at first glance, because it seemed like, clicking the submit button submits the form. So what's the difference between handling a submit event on the form versus a click event on the button? So the difference between those things comes down to accessibility. It's that there are actually multiple different ways that you can submit a form. One way is by clicking on the submit button, but also if you focus one of the inputs and then press enter, that also submits the form. And then there are probably other methods as well, like users with screen readers, blind people, probably have other methods of submitting forms without directly clicking on a submit button. I'm not exactly sure how that works for them, but generally speaking, handling the submit event on the form is more like standards compliant. And it's more likely that other people's tools are going to work well with the website you've built. Whereas if you just handle the click event on the submit button, you're handling a very specific interaction. You're describing that there's only one way that this form can be submitted. So generally, to make your forms more accessible, more usable to a variety of people, it's preferred to handle a submit event on the form instead of a click event on the submit button.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That's a really good point. Yeah, there's a lot of baked in behavior with forms and using HTML. And I'm just kind of going through the exercises that we have, and I think they're pretty good. The main thing is one of them touches, like we only looked at one or two methods on the DOM, and there are methods to like add HTML elements and delete stuff. I think you folks should be able to see that, and with a little help, from Raphael or myself or TA, get through that pretty well. Yeah, are there other questions? I know we covered like so much material today. I'm just curious what questions people have. Yeah, and Dalton, to be honest, I don't think you're supposed to feel comfortable. Both because learning a lot of this stuff is new and because of the pace of the boot camp. In a lot of ways, it's like working at a startup. Like when I worked at my first startup, I definitely did not feel comfortable. And I think we're all doing our best with that, but that's an okay feeling to have. Like that probably means you're about right where you should be. Yeah, and what did someone want to see with the HTML? Like what in particular were they looking at?
Sorry, I meant the JavaScript file.
Oh, with the JavaScript, what did you want to see?
The handle form submit.
Got it. Yeah, and a lot of this I kind of copy pasted. The key thing here being this switch. Yeah, there definitely are a lot of different pieces here. And honestly, I think you folks are doing pretty well. And also just thank you for kind of bearing with me as I'm kind of like getting up to speed with this material as well. Honestly, I would also recommend, going through some of the exercises in the curriculum this afternoon, because that's something I think I would like to improve on. Is I didn't like walk through a lot of those, and those examples are really good, and it's just the more you do it and get it under your fingers, I think the more it helps. And Raphael, maybe we should just stop the recording now if we haven't.
We could.
Or actually maybe not, because if people have more questions. But let me share what I mean real quick, because there's a couple things that I didn't get to, and I think in the future I'll try to make sure that we cover. In particular, this section, accessing elements from the DOM, goes through a lot of different methods and then has a lot of examples. And I think simply writing out and running these examples will help. And just to confirm, everyone, I didn't write my functions this way in JavaScript, but does this look familiar to people, this bit that I've highlighted here? That this is like a function declaration in JavaScript? And if not, maybe we should very quickly review that.
That looks about right. Does it make a difference? How it's called in the HTML?
Not for our purposes, not at
Great.
the moment. Okay, and I just wanted to check in on that. Because I know if I was learning this stuff, I think the context switching could be a challenge. And this is also a somewhat newer way, though it's been around for a while now. Okay, cool. Well, it's 12:13. We could either look at one more example of something that I could throw in there, or if people have questions about how do you kind of connect the dots and put these pieces together and what do you do with them or where should I start, we could talk about those, or we can wrap it up and go to lunch. Danielle, do you have a question?
I have a question with the, like in the curriculum, if you scroll all the way down, the last function that show greeting.
Yeah.
It's calling an greeting output, like an get element by ID.
Yeah.
Which in the example is empty. So it should start as false because in the next line it's saying if greeting output, which it's false at the beginning of the example because it's empty. So is there anything weird that the get element by ID is doing at the beginning? Because it's calling that ID output, that P tag,
you know,
which is empty
that's
at
a
the
great
beginning.
question. So let's do this. Let's throw in another form. And actually, I think this will be a great thing to walk through very quickly. And what I'm going to do is put everything in a div and give it a color so that it's easy to see. And this is actually a good example too of just how to debug stuff and build stuff. Like, you know, I've got this is here. Let me see actually even better if I can just comment all this stuff out just for the moment. Perfect. And now let's go to that example and let's grab this code. And there's the show greeting method. And there's handle form submit and all this stuff going on. And we'll put it here. And I'm just going to do a quick sanity check now that I've done all this stuff to see what happens.
Don't you need to put the script in script tags?
I should have a script tag to load that. Have handle form submit. Oh, did I comment that out? I did. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great example of like an error that is easy to make. And now I'm seeing a complaint in here that we've got two handle form submit methods. So I'm just we're gonna do a quick little edit and rename that handle form submit method. we're gonna do the same thing with show greeting because we've got two methods with the same name. So I think we're okay. And then I probably need to change that. There's something I didn't quite get right there that I think I might need to fix.
It's probably not like in the show greeting call because you changed the function name that it's referring to originally.
Yeah, I think I outsmarted myself because I want this one.
Yeah, now you have the show greeting form data get name above your.
Yeah,
show
I
data.
apologize. I changed the name of the wrong thing. Give me 1 sec, folks. Handle form submit 2, show greeting 2, show greeting 2. And then here, this should just be handle form submit. Let's see if that works. Yeah, now I think we're cooking. Okay, awesome. Sorry about that. So I think, and Danielle, your question was about this show greeting method. Okay. And sorry, I think I got all this. There it is. Got a little lost in my own code. And we are running along, so I apologize. I meant this to be fast, which I guess is just another sort of lesson. Yeah, so with this guy, it gets called in the handle form submit method. And if you look in that form from the curriculum, we do have this. You know what, I gotta pause. Yeah, I'm gonna.
Like that thing is supposed to print something on that p.id when you submit the form, but when it's calling the function, it's calling it with a name that is getting from the form, but the initial place where you're going to write the result is empty. So it's saying in the line 79, I think, it's saying if greeting output, which it should be true at some point, but that's the output of the function. It should write something. So at the when it's gonna write something, it's always gonna be empty. So how does that become true? Because that's what I'm wondering. Like, if is it anything to do with the event listener or something?
Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying. I'm sorry that it took me so long. So there's this element right here that's a paragraph, and it has an ID attribute whose value is output. And so right here, this grabs that paragraph. And I don't know, I honestly, I should have caught this when reviewing the lesson, because I think this is a little confusing. Because what it's doing essentially is saying like, hey, does a paragraph exist? And if so, let's print a message.
Right, I thought it was picking the value of that p tag, but I guess it just like checks if the p tag exists.
Yeah, which, and in fact, let's visualize that a little. So there's this paragraph here, and I suspect, like, instead of if greeting output, yeah, let's see what happens. Yeah, so something is not quite right in my code, but what they want to do is change the value of this to say, hello, Adam. And that's why they want to check that this paragraph exists. And I just, in my copying pasting, I got a little lost. And so in fact, I'll just show this quickly in the curriculum again to answer your question. Right here, all it's testing is, does this variable have a truthy value? And in JavaScript, that's anything that's not false, 0, null, or an empty string. And so we grab this paragraph element. And if it exists, they want to change the inner HTML of that paragraph element to display a message. And here's that element right there with the ID in question.
Right. So just to like summarize, when you do that get something by ID, it just returns the whole line, like the whole HTML element, not just what's inside the brackets, right?
Yeah, exactly. It grabs the whole node from the DOM.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and in fact,
remember before when we were console logging some elements and we opened them up in the inspector and we saw that they had just like dozens and dozens of properties we were scrolling through? The content is just one of those properties. They've got a whole bunch of other information inside of them.
yeah, for sure. And now I've hooked it up correctly and you can actually see the change that happens here. I do apologize that took so long. I think it probably is a good time for us to stop because we ran pretty long. So thank you folks for being so patient. That was a great question. I just, it's lunchtime for me too. And I'll make sure this code is up, and Danielle or folks, if anyone else has questions about this or anything else, please just throw it in the Romeo questions on Slack so that myself or Raphael can answer it, and also that other people can see it and learn from it as well. So thank you folks so much. Raphael, is there anything that you want to touch on or mention before we break for lunch?
Yeah, just one little thing I want to say really quick, just about default events. We showed you preventing the default form submission behavior, and by far that's the most common use case for preventing a default event. You're really never going to want the default form submission behavior to happen, so you're always going to prevent that. But I think it's fun to know that there are a variety of other default events that happen in the browser that are preventable. So for example, when you click on a link, when you click on an anchor tag, it takes you to some external URL. When you type into an input box, it puts characters, the ones you typed on your keyboard, into that input box. You press the space bar, it scrolls you down the page, like Command R refreshes. These are all default events in the browser, and you can prevent them. So if you actually want to prevent default on every event, then the page is like basically dysfunctional. People just can't type anything with their keyboard. Many common keyboard shortcuts will fail. Yeah, oh, so sometimes like when people try in vain to prevent you from stealing like pictures or whatever, they might disable right click, prevent default on right click, so that you can't like save image as or whatever. In Google Drive, they do that, prevent default on right click, so that they can have their own custom right click menu, which is kind of cool. So that's actually like a practical reason to prevent default on something. Yeah,
that's a really good point. And I was hoping to demo preventing the key press. I think, do I have to add a listener to the input element to set up to do that?
Yeah, so just go back to what you had just a second ago. Yeah, the add event listener.
Or like key press maybe?
Yeah, key press. Key press is the event that actually puts letters on the screen. Just prevent default.
Thank you. Let's see if that works. Yeah. So well, you guys can't see that I'm pressing on the keyboard, but you'll just have to trust me that I am. And nothing's happening. And here, it works fine. And then if I want to disable it for this one, by the way, the up arrow, up and down takes you through your history in the console. What was it, favorite color? Did I get that right? Yeah. And now I can't type anything in here either. Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you for pointing that out.
I guess another practical use of this is like sometimes when you click on a link and you want to make, like the user might have had work in progress. So you want to ask for confirmation, like, are you sure you want to leave? You have, unsaved data or whatever. You can prevent default on the link so that it doesn't actually navigate when they click on it. And then after they confirm, then it takes them where it was going.
Yeah, totally.
So when you prevent a default on a link, for example, where would you go to then rewrite those defaults to do what you want? And in that case, wouldn't you be rewriting them anyway without the prevent default? Or,
what do you mean?
I guess if you make a link and then you add prevent default to it, maybe I'll just have to play with that on my own.
Yeah, I also, sorry, go ahead, Raphael.
No, I got nothing.
I was just gonna say, I do want to break us for lunch because it's 12:30. But Justin, could you throw that question in Romeo questions, and then we can follow up with you? And that's also a good chance to just share. You can like get rid of a listener. You can create it and you can delete it. But I don't want to, though it's enticing, I don't want to open another door because I think we need to break for lunch so that everyone can eat and stuff.